Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. I am Mr. Kadim Khan and I am a lecturer in the Institute of Computing, Quad University of Science and Technology. Today we will take lecture number 22 of the subject of visual programming, in which we are going to discuss the exception handling in C#.NET. Dear students, as we know that exception handling is used to handle the runtime errors in the programming. There are different exception handling techniques, and these are in fact handled in the try-catch statement of the exception handling. In these lectures, we will explain all the exception handlings techniques and also with the C#.NET programming examples. This is the discussion agenda. It contains the topics of the exception handlings and how the .NET handles the exceptions. Then we have the types of exception in the .NET frameworks, syntax of exception handlings. Here we will discuss the try-catch programming constructs used for the exception handling. Then we have different examples of the exception handling, including the array index out of bound exception, format exception, and divide by zero exception, stack overflow exceptions. And also we will discuss that if you want to still throw the exceptions, even if it is handled, you can use rethrowing and exceptions. And finally, we have the finally clause of the exception handling. First, what is the exception? Exceptions is a certain errors or defects which occurs during the run times of the applications. When the application is running and in the runtime, due to, for example, using a certain input or output problems, then the exceptions will be thrown and the exception will be raised here. So exception is a certain notifications in which something interrupts the normal program execution. When the certain exception arises, then the state of program is saved. Means that the execution is saved for the current statements where the exception has been raised, and the normal flow is interrupted and the control is passed to in the exception handler. The exception handler is special routine in the Visual C#.NET and also in the whole Visual Studio, which handles the exception. Now, for examples, if we try to open a file which doesn't exist in the directory, then the particular code will be responsible for opening the files will detect that there is the problem in opening the file because the file is not available for us. And CLR, which is the common language runtime routine, will throw the exceptions with the error message to the user. So the exception will be in fact called the CLR will provide certain error message with the exceptions, and the user will identify the particular error message and then will decides what he or she is wanting to do. For example, if you are opening a certain files which is existing but there is the format problem, then the exception will rise that this files is not readable and the program will be crashed there at runtime. So exception handling is a special technique which save the programs and also it avoids to crash the program at runtime. Now exceptions in the .NET is in fact in the .NET and in object, and that provides us particular signals that where the error has occurred. So exception in the .NET is in objects here, means that this is a special object which is derived from the exception class, and it provides us the informations that where the problem is anticipated which has disturbed the normal flow of the executions here. So when certain event which is unusual take place, then the executing a particular method throws the objects containing information about the types of the errors that has been encountered and the place in the program where this particular errors has occurred, as well as the program state at the moment of the error. So exceptions handling is a special technique which identifies that what is the errors and where that particular error has occurred. So the special message is provided used for the exception handling. Now exceptions in the .NET contain so-called stack trace, which gives information where exactly errors has occurred. So we will use the stack trace of special function which provides a complete information about the exceptions which has been occurred and also the location where that particular exception has been raised. So how the .NET frameworks, that is the CLR, handles the exceptions. This is the CLR. CLR is the Common Language Runtime Routine. In the .NET, CLR is responsible for declaring and also defining the common language for all certain languages. For example, in the .NET we have the visual programming in the form of the ASP.NET. Also we have the C#.NET. Also we have the Visual C++, Visual Basics.NET, Visual J#.NET or Visual FH.NET. So there are many languages in the .NET. CLR creates a certain language which is common for all such technologies and that is understandable by the compiler. So .NET CLR, which is Common Language Runtime, is a special package or a routine which also handles the exceptions. So CLR start the execution of the program from the main function. Now in the main function there may be one, two or multiple functions or subfunction, also called the methods. So CLR first execute the first method which are there in the main. After first methods, if there is another method, then that method will be executed and so on, and the last method will be executed at last. So CLR call all the methods in the sequential format. But CLR throws the exceptions that the last function which has been processed by the CLR, first of all, the exception will be in fact identified there. So the exception will be thrown by the last function first, and then the second last, and then the first, and so on. The first function will throw the exception. So here, this function will find the handler which is implemented in the CLR. Then this next function, that is the second previous function, will find the handler for the exception handling which is in fact implemented in that CLR. And finally, the final function, which is the function 1, will also find the exception handler routines, and finally the main function will in fact find the exception handler routine, and then all this will be communicated with the .NET CLR. And CLR, which is the Common Language Runtime Routine, will displays the exception message. So CLR is responsible to display the particular exception that has been occurred in the modules or methods in the main function. By this way, the CLR execute the exceptions. Now, in the .NET, there are many types of exceptions, and all the exceptions are inherited from the object class, while exceptions class is also inherited from the object class. There are two types of exception in the exception class: system exception and the application exception. In the system exception, we have the external exceptions. Also, we have the aggregate exceptions, argument exception, divide by zero exception, null reference exception, and overflow exception. Now, the external exception is the COM exception. A COM exception means that component object model. These are certain COM objects are the components which resides outside of our projects, and these can be integrated with our projects. That's why these are called the external exceptions. Now, in the system exception, also we have the aggregate exception, which provide the collection of all sort of the exceptions. The argument exceptions is thrown when we do not provide the proper parameters to the functions. And there are two types of the argument exception: argument null exception and argument out of range exception. Argument null exception occurs when we do not provide any sort of the argument or parameters to the functions, while argument out of range exception occurs when the arguments are out of range. For example, when we provide certain arrays in the argument or in the parameters which is out of range of the size of the arrays, then argument exceptions for argument out of range exception will be raised there. Divide by zero exception will occur when we divide some integer value or some any other numerical values through the zero. Through the zero, it provides us divide by zero exception, and it is not possible to divide any value through the zero. Null reference exception means that when we provide such a reference which is null, or we do not provide the reference which is null here. Overflow exceptions occurs when we store certain values which is larger than the size of the array. For example, the array size is 10 and we are storing the 11th value, then the overflow exception will rise here. Now this is the syntax of exception handling. First is the try statement. In the try block, we will provide certain codes on which the exceptions will be maybe raised here, and this is the man code which will be enclosed in the try statement. While in the catch block is we will provide or we will identify which types of exception may arise here. For example, invalid operation exceptions, and here we will define the message which will be raised or which will be shown when this exception will rise. And here is the some other sort of the exceptions, and here is the body of the catch. And if you don't know about any sort of exception, you can also write the generalized catch statements where you will not mention the exception types. And if you still want to throw the exception, even if you want also the message and still you want that the exception will be thrown by the CLR, then you will write here the throw keyword. And final statement is used to clean up any operations that is started, and also the final operations is used to release the resources which has been captured or which has been occupied here in the try statement. This is the example of the try-catch programming constructs. To handle an exception, we have to surround the code that could be thrown the exception with the try-catch statements. This is the try. Here we will write the code, and these are two different types of exception types, and here we will define our own object. And similarly the exception types, and here we can define our own object. So we will write the code which has certain exception, or maybe certain exception may be raised during the runtime. That code will be provided in the try statement, while in the catch statements the exceptions may be raised here. This is the example of the exceptions. For example, here is the index out of bound exceptions. This is the public static void main function string args, and here is the array. It is the integer array, and the name of the array is a is equal to new int 1000. It means that a array contains 1000 elements. Now we want to assign the elements to this array through using certain loops. So here we will use the for loop. For int I is equal to 0, I is less than 5000 and I plus plus. So clearly you can see that the loop is starting from the 0 and it will be executed up to 4999, and here the loop will be incremented, and the counter variable is assigned to the arrays. So ai is equal to I means that I is assigning to the arrays. Now this program will be fine if we are here providing the element thousands, but this is more than the thousands, that means it is 5,000. So it 1,000s are it here, it exactly it 1,000, the exception will be raised here, and the exception will be this message which is thrown by the CLR, and the exception is index out of range exception was unhandled, and exception was that the outside boundary of the array. That means that this is the exceptions here. So the exception will be raised here. Now we can enclose that particular code in the try-catch statements to handle the exceptions. Again, here we have static void main function. The program execution will start from the void main. Here is the array, and the array is of the 1000 integer values. There is the try-catch statements. In the try-catch statement, exception may be raised here, and we are here using the infinite loop because there is no condition. So loop start from 0 up to infinite, and the values are assigned here. So when the value will be in fact 999, that is exactly 1000 values will be assigned to the arrays, then the exception will rise here it 1000. So exception will be raised, and what is the exception that will be catched in the catch statement? In the catch statement is the index out of range exception e. It is you have to provide the specific name of the exceptions here with the objects. E is the object, and the message will be thrown or will be displayed here using the console.write e.toStrings function. So here the message will be in fact displayed here console.write e.toString function here. Now the exception will be catched here in the catch statement. This is the another example of the exceptions, and the example is the format exception and divide by zero exception. Now format exception is a certain exception which can be thrown when we provide a wrong format for the inputs. For example, if a student wants to enter his marks or her marks, and mistakenly if he or she is entering the string data, for example, marks may be in the numeric data 80 or 70, and she or he is entering, for example, ABC, then the format exception will be raised here. And divide by zero exception is an exception when we divide a certain value through the zero. And so when we divide any value by a zero, then the divide by zero exception will be raised here. Now this is public stated void main function. Program execution starts from here. This is the body of the main function. Then here we have the try, and there are two catch statements. In the try statement, we will enclose that particular code where the program may have an exception at runtime. So here is first of all console.write lines, enter any two number. This will display the message in the console class of the write function. So this function will just print this message on the console screen. Here there are two integer variables, number 1 and number 2, and they are taken through the keyboard console.read lines, and because the console.read lines is taking the strings, that's why it is required to be typecasted into integer, and it will be assigned to the number 1. Similarly, console.readlines in that parse, it is also be taken into the string, and we need to typecast it into integers, so that's why in that parse function is used, and then it is assigned to the second numbers, which is the integer data types. Here is the expression int number 3 is equal to number 1 divided by number 2, and console.line division is equal to plus number 3, so this will display the results here. Console.line division plus is used for the calculation, Now, catch statements will catch the exception. First catch statement is about the format exception E. So, console you must enter two integer plus invalid number format. So that means these two strings will be concatenated with each other, and it says that you must need to enter two integer, and this is because it is the invalid number format. If a user is entering uh, alphabetical data here, for example A B C, then this will here this statement will raise exception because that cannot be assigned to the integer here. So that's why there will be certain runtime exceptions. And the second exception is divide by zero. If mistakenly, if the user is entering here the zero and here is he or she is entering 10. So 10 cannot be divided by zero. So that's why there will be exception in this statement. So the exception will be divided by zero exception E console data second number cannot be zero plus invalid divisor. That means that divisor cannot be zero. Stack overflow exception is a certain exception which rise when the stack is overflow. Usually it is the exception which is handled or which is in fact provided when we want to eliminate the or um, to stop the programs to be crashed by utilizing too much cache memories. So for this purpose, this function is calling itself continuously. You can see that this is the recursive function in the try statement and this is the catch. Stack overflow exception will be raised here. Now this function is calling itself in the body. Here recursive function is a public statement void recursive and still it's calling recursive. So it means that the function call itself here, and when we call this function in the try statements, then infinite times this function will be called, and in fact the CLR will be out of stack space. So here the stack overflow exception will work, and here we will define our own error message that the CLR is out of stack space. Now sometimes we still require to throw in exceptions, means that we still want that the exception will be thrown here. So for this purpose in the a catch statement we still have to write just throw AE. Throw AE will rethrow the exception. So exception will be thrown here by using throw AE. Even if the exception is raised here in the try statement and it is catched here, that is the arithmetic exception AE, so it will be thrown here. Now this is the output of the previous examples that catch format exception E console data you must enter two integer invalid number format catch divided by zero exception E console data and second number cannot be 0 plus invalid division and through EE still the exception will be thrown here. So you can see that if the first number enter is 10 and the second number is 0. So here it is the divide by 0 exceptions because second number divisor cannot be 0. So second number cannot be 0 invalid divisor, and still you can see that the message provided by CLR is also shown here because of the throw E. So unhandled exception system that divide by 0 exception is occurring here. So attempted to divide by 0 it this application's statement and the exception is right here in the uh, main function there, and the exception line is 32 here. Now dear students, we will execute this example in the Visual Studio. For this purpose click on the escape and start your Visual Studio here. This is my Visual Studio. I have the latest version of 2019. So when you will click on the Visual Studio, so meanwhile the Visual Studio will be up here for you where you can program for the any exception handling techniques. Now we will create new projects here. So click on the create new project so that the Visual Studio will create a new project for you. And here we will create, or we will in fact use Windows application instead of using the console application. So here we are opening a Windows application to provide you the examples of the exception handling. Now Visual Studio as says that what types of program you need. So here we will switch towards the C sharp language. Here is the C sharp language, and if you come down here, there is the console application and this is the Windows application. So select the Windows application, click on next. When you select the Windows application, there will be the Windows application. It is Windows application form 11. Now I want to um, create a web browser for you which will handle the exceptions here. So here I will type web browser, web browser. Now click on the create. When you will click on the create, the Visual Studio is now going to create a project by name of the web browser. So I'm creating a simple web browser. If you will provide the URL, then the URL will be fetched from the online, from the internet. And if you don't provide the URL and still you click, then the exception handling techniques will be used here. So this is the forms here. Click on the toolbox. Click on the common controls. Select or drag drop one buttons here. Then again go here. Also drag drop one text box controls here where I will type the URL. Also drag drop one label controls here. Now also drag drop the web browser controls here, which is the built-in controls for fetching the pages. Now go to the properties for the buttons. Click here. For example, just right here, go, and here click on the label and change its text property that enter URL uniform resource locator, that is the website. Now I have designed my form here. Just double click to create the event. I have double clicks on the go buttons here, and now I will use a simple example without the exception. So the control name is web browser 1, web browser dot navigate function. Navigate function will fetch the URL. So it will now fetch the URL here, and you need to provide the input from the text box. So our text box is text box 1, and here we will enter the URL and the URL will be thrown here. The URL will be provided to the text box, and then it will be navigated or browsed using the navigate function of the web browser. Now if I will run these examples or execute these examples in the Visual Studio, now you will see that the certain output will be available for us where you can navigate any URL in this simple web browser. Visual Studio is compiling the program and running the application. Now the output will be appeared here. Now this is the output. If I leave this text box filled, for example, if I want to fill some data with it, like www.kust.edu.pk, now this website will be fetched here. And if I click on the go button, you will see that the websites will be fetched here in this web browser controls. Meanwhile, the system is browsing the page here in this web browser controls, and the URL is www.kust.edu.pk. So there is, in fact, the script. This script is utilized by this program, so that's why, due to the security reason, this message may rise here. So you can just click on yes buttons. Now you can see that the scripts in this page has been shown here, and this is the university page which has been fetched here. Now if I leave this text box empty and still click on the go buttons, then you will see that nothing will be displayed here, and the generalized message will be displayed here. You can see that now there is nothing, and we cannot understand that what is the problem here. The user will be unable to understand here that what is the problem here. Now to solve these problems, to raise the exceptions here, we will use the try catch block statement. So just uh, close the output. First here we will write here the try statement, try, and then the catch statement, then the catch statement. This is try and this one is catch statement. Now put this code into the try statement here. Just drag drop this code here. While in the catch statement, you need to write a generalized exception class. This is the generalized exception class here. Now here we are using the if statements, that if the text box is empty, if text box one dot text is equal to empty string, then message box dot show function, here the error message will be displayed, must have to be displayed here, that for example, please write the URL. Now this message will be shown in the text box here. Now I have completed the code here, but it will not catch any exceptions here. Just click on the starts and run here. When you will click here, you can see that this error message is not displayed here. But when you will type here a valid URL, for example google.com, and click here, then the Google page will be displayed here. But if you will make it empty, then you can see that this error message is not working here, and there is no certain exception handling. Now, if I want to throw the exceptions here, means that if I want to, so I will remove the try and catch statements from here, and still I want to throw the exceptions. So here I will use the if statements, that if text box is empty, the text is equal to empty, then the system will throw the exceptions here. So if it is empty, it will throw the exception. If it is not empty, then the else statement will be executed, and the browser will fetch the page here. So I will write here throw new argument exception. So here it takes the message which will be displayed in the exception. So for example, here will be that please fill the text box. Now this message will be provided in exceptions when I leave the text boxes unempty, that is empty. Now for example, same I will execute for the Google as the input. So click here, you can see that the Google page has been displayed here. But what will happen when I will make it empty? So when I make it empty, the exceptions message right here. Please fill the text box. Now, what you have to do now is to write this code in the try catch statement, because now the exception has been catched here that you must have to fill the text box which was not working in the previous example. Now, just I want to explain you that the exception was not thrown when just I used the web browser navigate function. So the exception was not thrown. Now I have make a certain logic that the exception is not throwing. That is, the exception is now throwing. That is using throw new argument exception, and this is message appeared. Again, I'm displaying this examples. If you click on the empty, then the exception has raised here. This is the exception which was not rising when you just provide this one line code. Now I want to handle this exception here. So for this purpose, stop the program and go to the try statement. This is the try statement, and I have closed this whole code in the try, and here I will write the catch statement. Catch statement, and here I will create the body of the catch statement. Here just write the exception class E. For example, it can be a given that empty. For example, just exception, and right here the message box dot show function is the message box which will display the message, and you can copy this same message here, copy it and paste it here. Now run the application. Now if you provide the valid URL, for example google.com, and click on the go button, Google will be displayed here. Now without the try catch statement, when I clicked on the go button, when this was empty, the program was crashed. And now you can see that the program is not crashing, and just it guides me that please fill the text box here. I will click on OK, and then I will fill this text box for the valid URL, for example www.bbcurdu.com, and click on go. Now BBC Urdu page will be displayed here. Now you can see this is the BBC Urdu page here. So here is the mechanism for displaying the message, and in this situation you can see that the exception was not occurring. Now I create a logic where the exception is still occurring here, and then I resolve the exception and through the try catch statement, and it is a generalized exception class exception, and the exception was thrown here and the message was shown. Now we will resume our slides. I have demonstrated a different example than the example in the slides, so because I want to give the idea, that is the full idea. Now we have the finally class as well in the exception handling. The finally class is responsible for releasing the resources. The final blocks must be executed, and it appears after the catch blocks, and it always executes. Means that even an exception is there or not there, then it will be executed, and it is used to release the resources. The resources may be, for example, the hardware resources, software resources as well. This is the example of the finally catch statement. That is try statement. In the here, first we have declared two variables, and also here is the integer age variables. Enter your first name. Here it will take the first name from the keyboard, enter your age, and the value will be read from the keyboard, and it will be stored in the age text variable. Here is the try final statements, and you can see there is no catch statements. So you can omit the catch statements here, but you cannot omit the try statement, and final statement must be executed, and it may be or may not be, but if even that exception is there or not there, then the final statement will be executed. So in the try statement, we just read the age here and typecast it into integer, and here they are displaying these two information and the age in terms of the months. So you are for example 20 months old, or if you have entered 1 year, then your age is 12 months. And finally block says that console data and goodbye and first name, goodbye your name, whatever you name you have entered here. Now, dear student, this is the end of the class. If you want to read more, there are two books references. These are very good books. And if still you have any questions, you can ask the questions to the email. My email is m.kadim@redcast.edu.pk. I will wait for your email and I'll respond to you immediately as soon as I get your emails. Thank you very much.